My name is Faith Myers, and the day my parents showed me exactly where I stood in their world. They did it in a room full of lawyers, polished oak, and the faint scent of magnolia from the garden outside. The will reading had already been tense, my mother's rehearsed smile, my father's eyes fixed on the table, my sister leaning back like she was waiting for a crown. Then the lawyer slid a check for $10 million across the table to her, and I watched her fingers curl around it like it was her birthright. I didn't expect anything, but I wasn't prepared for what came next. My father's voice was calm, almost gentle. Go earn your own. That was it. No explanation, no softened edge, just a dismissal sharp enough to slice the air between us. I kept my hands folded, my pulse hammering so loudly I thought they might hear it. I told myself not to react, not to give them the satisfaction. But then, at the far end of the table, an older man in a gray suit I didn't recognize stood up. "There's one more document," he said, pulling a worn envelope from his briefcase. The paper was creased, the ink faded, and my grandfather's handwriting sprawled across the front. My mother's smile faltered, my father's jaw twitched, my sister's knuckles whitened around her check. That envelope, I knew, carried something they hadn't prepared for. Something meant for me. In that moment, the room shifted. The air felt heavier, like it was bracing for impact. I didn't know exactly what my grandfather had left behind, or why it needed to be read in front of all of them. But I could feel it. This was not going to be another moment they got to define me. I straightened my back and locked my eyes on the lawyer as he slid the envelope open. Whatever was inside, it wasn't just paper. It was the crack in the foundation my family had built on silence, control, and carefully curated lies. And it was about to blow everything wide open. The lawyer didn't open the envelope right away. He placed it carefully on the table, almost like he knew its weight wasn't in the paper. But in the way my family was staring at it, his eyes flicked toward my grandmother, who sat 2 seats down from me, her hands folded in her lap, a slight tremor in her fingers. "Faith," she said, her voice cutting through the charged silence. "Come to the house after this. There's something we need to talk about." She didn't look at my parents. That told me everything. Whatever this was, it wasn't part of their script. When the meeting finally adjourned, my sister, Melanie, swept out first, heels striking the floor like she was keeping time for her own parade. My parents followed, murmuring to each other in clipped, controlled tones. No one spoke to me. They didn't even glance my way. I drove straight to my grandmother's ranch on the outskirts of Charleston. I hadn't been there in over a year, not since the spring before my grandfather died. It used to be my favorite place in the world, where the sound of wind through the magnolia trees meant safety, and the porch swing creaked like it was whispering secrets just for me. But that afternoon, as I turned into the long gravel driveway, the air felt different, heavier, watchful. The white paint on the front door was still chipped in the same places I remembered from childhood. The wind chimes above the porch still hung crooked, clinking together in a breeze that smelled faintly of cut grass and something older, the scent of memories that hadn't been disturbed in a long time. I hesitated before knocking. The last time I'd come here, Melanie had answered the door, told me no one was home, and shut it in my face. At the time, I believed her. Now, after the will reading, I wasn't so sure. The door creaked open before my knuckles hit the wood. "So," my grandmother said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass, "you finally decided to show up." Her arms were crossed, her jaw set like stone. I searched her face for warmth, relief, even confusion, anything that might mean she'd missed me. But there was nothing there except cold restraint. "Grandma, what's going on?" I asked, stepping over the threshold. "They told me you were too busy," she said flatly, "that you didn't want to be bothered, that you had a new life." Her voice wavered for just a moment before it hardened again. "Your grandfather called for you. Faith, every day, in those last weeks, he asked for you." The words hit me like a body blow. "That's not true," I said. My throat suddenly dry. I tried to call. I came by in March. Melanie was here. She told me no one was home. Her eyes narrowed. We were here. We were always here. The silence that followed was like a living thing pressing down on us both. Then she turned without another word and disappeared into the back of the house. I followed, my boots thudding on the worn floorboards. The air inside was thicker, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. She returned a moment later, carrying a worn leather notepad. "This is the number he kept calling," she said, handing it to me. I recognized my grandfather's blocky, slightly slanted handwriting immediately, but the number wasn't mine, not even close. "Grandma, I've had the same phone number since college," I said slowly. She stared at the page, her brows knitting together. "They told us you'd changed it, that you didn't want to be tracked down, that you were ashamed of us." The room seemed to tilt slightly. "No," I said, backing against the wall for balance. "They lied to you. They cut me off on purpose." Her hands trembled. She lowered herself into the floral armchair by the fireplace, like her knees had given out. "They told me the funeral was at noon," I whispered. I got to the church, and it was empty. Her face went pale. "The funeral was at 9, she said softly. "They told everyone you didn't show, that you didn't care." My breath caught in my chest. I would never have missed his funeral. Never. I sank down beside her, gripping her hand like I was 10 years old again. "I didn't know," I said. "I didn't even know he was sick until it was too late." Her hand softened around mine, brushing her thumb over my knuckles. "We know the truth now?" she said quietly. "That's what matters. We know." We sat there for a long time in a heavy, loaded silence. Outside, the wind picked up and pushed a scatter of dry leaves across the porch, like restless memories. Finally, my grandmother stood. Her hands still shook, but her eyes burned with a fire I hadn't seen in years. "I'm calling them." "Calling who?" She didn't answer. She went to the old rotary phone in the kitchen, the one my grandfather refused to replace, and began dialing. Each click of the dial sounded deliberate, like punctuation to a sentence she'd been waiting too long to say. When the line connected, her voice turned cold, clipped. "Betty, I need you, Jacob, and Melanie here, now." "No, it can't wait. Be here in an hour." She hung up without saying goodbye. Then she turned to me. "The lawyer's on his way, too. Your grandfather left some things, instructions, but he made it clear they were to be read only with everyone present, so that's exactly what we're going to do." For the next hour, I sat at the small kitchen table, tracing my fingers along the worn edge. I thought about how many mornings my grandfather had sat here sipping coffee, reading the scientific journals I mailed him from college, how he'd asked about my research like it mattered, even when no one else did. The air felt different now, not hostile, but charged, like the whole house was waiting. Footsteps echoed on the porch. The doorbell rang. "Stay here," my grandmother said, her hand on my shoulder. "I'll call you when it's time." From the kitchen, I heard them arrive one by one, my mother's overly sweet voice. "Oh my goodness, it smells exactly the same in here." My father's low, measured tone. "I thought this was already handled." Melanie's impatient sigh. "Seriously? This couldn't wait until after the estate was processed?" Then, my grandmother's voice, colder than I'd ever heard it. "Please sit down, Mr. Harold Kent is on his way. He'll be reading Walter's final instructions." I could picture their faces, confused, curious, a little annoyed. They didn't know I was here. The front door creaked again. A new voice, steady and professional. "This won't take long, but it must be done properly." My grandmother called out, "Faith, come in now." My heart thudded against my ribs as I stepped through the kitchen doorway into the living room. 3 heads turned in unison. My mother's smile froze. My father's jaw tightened. Melanie's face drained of color. They weren't just surprised to see me. They were afraid. I didn't let my gaze waver. If they were expecting me to shrink back into the kitchen like I used to, they were going to be disappointed. Grandma gestured to the empty armchair across from them. "Sit, Faith!" I crossed the room slowly, keeping my chin level. The lawyer, Mr. Kent, gave me a polite nod, his face unreadable, and set his leather briefcase on the coffee table. My parents exchanged a glance so quick most people would have missed it, but I caught it. It was the same look they gave each other whenever something didn't go according to plan, a silent conversation that always seemed to end with my exclusion. Mr. Kent unlatched the brass clasps on his briefcase and pulled out a thick manila envelope. "This," he began, "is the last will and testament of Walter James Myers, recorded and sealed per his request." My father leaned back like he was bracing for a formality. My sister sat forward, expectant. My mother folded her hands neatly in her lap, every muscle in her face taut with composure. "In addition to the official documents," Mr. Kent continued, "he included a handwritten letter to be read aloud here, in front of the family." Melanie let out a small, bitter laugh. "Of course he did." Grandma didn't so much as glance at her. She opened the drawer of the side table and took out an envelope worn at the edges, passing it to the lawyer without looking away from my sister. "He wrote this the week before he died. Made me promise it would be read with everyone here." Mr. Kent unfolded the paper slowly, careful not to crease it further. My grandfather's handwriting sprawled across the page in broad, deliberate strokes. I could almost see his hand moving the pen, slow but sure. "To my granddaughter, Faith," he began, his voice steady. "If this is being read, I am no longer beside you, but my belief in you remains stronger than ever." The words settled over me like a warm wind. I gripped the armrests, forcing myself to stay still. "You have always been the quiet one." The letter went on. "The observer, the thinker, the one who asked why, even when no one else cared to. You built your own truth in a family that never learned to honor yours." I felt something shift in my chest, not rage, not even sadness, but recognition. "You were never a mistake, Faith. You are the legacy I am proudest of." Across the room, Melanie shifted in her seat, her arms crossing tight. My mother's fingers twisted together. My father stared at the window like the glass held something more important than the words in this room. "I saw you clutch that little notebook when you were 7, Mr. Kent read on, tracking how long it took raindrops to fill a glass. "I saw your face light up when you discovered patterns, while everyone else only saw distractions. I saw the way your joy dimmed when your mother brushed you off. The way your father changed the subject when you shared something you were proud of." My throat tightened. I remembered that notebook. I still had it somewhere. The bent cover, the ink stains, the shaky handwriting that straightened over the years as I learned to be precise. "Your sister," the letter continued, "sparkled in ways they understood, but you glowed in ways they couldn't translate. Instead of learning your language, they shut you out. I do not blame her entirely. She played the part she was given. But you wrote your own role. That takes courage." A tear slipped down my cheek. I didn't wipe it away. "I remember the day you won your first science fair. You asked me to hide the trophy because you said, 'Maybe if I don't show it, they'll stop looking at me like I'm someone else's child.' You deserved celebration, not invisibility. I can't undo what was done, but I can give you something that is entirely yours, a place to build without apology, without their shadows." Mr. Kent paused, folding the paper carefully and setting it down. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick with years of unspoken truths, layered resentments, and the brittle edges of pride. I took a breath. "I remember that science fair," I said softly. "Mom didn't come. She was at Melanie's dress rehearsal." Melanie flinched. My father's voice cut in, low and sharp. "Faith, this isn't the time to—" "No," I said, my voice firm. "This is the only time, because all I ever got from either of you was, 'Why can't you be more like your sister?'" I turned to Melanie. And from you? Every time I was proud of something, you turned it into a threat. She scoffed. Oh, come on. You've always made yourself the victim. I worked for what I have. I nodded slowly. You mean you visited Grandpa when it was convenient, smiled when you were told to, said the right things because you thought it would pay off. Her face hardened. And what? You think you're pure? You disappeared for years. I was cut off, I snapped. You told Grandma I didn't want to see her. You gave Grandpa a fake number and made sure I never got his messages. That's not distance. That's erasure. My mother shot to her feet. Enough! You're twisting everything. This family has been through— This family, Grandma said, her voice like a crack of ice, has been living a lie, and I let it happen too long. My mother turned, stunned. Mother, don't! I watched you all turn a blind eye to Faith's pain. I believed you when you said she didn't care. I should have known better. My father shifted uncomfortably, his voice clipped. Look, she got her education, her travel, her lab camps. That wasn't free. No, I said. It wasn't. But you didn't pay for any of it. Grandpa did. Every cent, every scholarship he found for me, every flight, every journal subscription. You didn't even know where I was half the time. You made me feel like a burden. He made me feel seen. Melanie stood abruptly, her chair scraping the floor. This is ridiculous. I was told I'd get everything. I was the one who stayed. I was the good daughter. No, I said calmly. You were the performer, the chosen one. I was the hidden one. But Grandpa didn't forget me, and now you don't get to erase me anymore. Her lips curled. Why should you get anything? Just because you're a sad little genius with a lab coat? A small, bitter smile touched my lips. No, I get something because I earned his love honestly. And that's the one thing you never understood. Love isn't a performance. Grandma rose from her chair, moving to the center of the room. Her steps were slow, but her voice was steady. I regret that Walter left you anything, she said, looking directly at Melanie. You may have played the role, but it was never love. It was a transaction, and I'm ashamed I didn't see it sooner. She turned to all of them. Leave! You're not welcome here. My mother gasped. You can't be serious. Out! Grandma said again. Now! They didn't move for a moment. The air taut. Then Melanie grabbed her bag and stormed out, her heels hitting the wood like gunshots. My parents followed, muttering about legal challenges, their voices fading down the porch steps. For the first time in my life, they left without taking anything with them. The door clicked shut behind them. No slamming, just finality. I stood still, unsure what to feel. The room was quiet now, not tense, not explosive, just free. Grandma walked past me and sank onto the sofa. Her hands, which had trembled moments earlier, now rested calmly in her lap. They'll come back, I said, my voice low. They always do. Maybe, she replied. But this time, we don't have to let them in. Her words settled into me like an anchor. For so long, I'd lived under an unspoken contract. If I proved myself enough, stayed useful enough, maybe they'd see me. Maybe they'd call me family without hesitation. But standing there with the echo of my grandfather's words still hanging in the air, I understood something painfully simple. I'd been trying to earn love from people who didn't have any to give. And he'd seen that long before I did. I needed air. The walls of the living room felt closer now that it was just me and Grandma. I walked toward the back door, my boots making the same slow thud on the floorboards I remembered from childhood. Outside, the porch boards creaked under my weight. The same sound that used to mean home, but now meant something else entirely, change. The magnolia trees in the far corner of the yard were still in bloom, their heavy white petals trembling in the breeze. Beyond the fence lay the same red dirt field where Grandpa once let me build my first greenhouse from scrap lumber and plastic sheeting. It had collapsed after 2 weeks, but he called it a perfect disaster and made me draw diagrams for how I'd build it better next time. We'd laughed about it for years. I thought about that little girl, 10 years old, knees muddy, eyes bright, hands sticky with sap. I wondered how long she'd been buried under expectations that weren't hers. When I went back inside, Grandma was in the kitchen, setting a kettle on the stove. She moved slowly now, but her motions were deliberate. "You know," she said without looking at me, "Walter started planning something for you 5 years ago, before he even got sick." I blinked. "For me?" She nodded. "He told me he wanted you to have a place where you didn't need anyone's permission to be yourself." The words hit harder than I expected. I swallowed against the tightness in my throat. That night, I stayed in my old room for the first time in years. The wallpaper was faded, the mattress too soft, but the glow-in-the-dark stars were still stuck to the ceiling, arranged in scientifically accurate constellations. Because I'd insisted on it, Grandpa hadn't questioned me. He never did. By morning, the idea of going back to my apartment in the city felt wrong. Instead, I poured 2 cups of coffee and sat with Grandma at the kitchen table, the same table I used to avoid when my parents visited. "So what now?" she asked, folding the newspaper. "I think I need to see it," I said. "The place he built." She didn't hesitate. "He'd like that." The annex sat at the end of a dusty road off Laurel Creek. From the outside, it looked like a converted barn, wide beams, a tin roof, and double doors that could have belonged on a horse stable. I parked my car and sat for a moment, staring at it, wondering how something so unassuming could feel so charged. When I pushed the doors open, sunlight flooded in through an entire wall of glass panels along the east side. Rows of work tables stretched across the floor, each one neatly arranged with untouched lab equipment. Microscopes, centrifuges, data tablets. A 3D printer, still wrapped in plastic, sat on a side bench. Shelves lined the back wall, stacked with unopened boxes labeled with my name in his handwriting. In the very center of the room stood a single workbench. On top of it lay a worn notebook with a bent cover. My breath caught. It was my childhood notebook, the one I thought I'd lost in college. The pages were still filled with my tiny, looping handwriting and messy diagrams of honeybee communication patterns. I reached out and touched the cover, my fingers trembling. My knees went weak, and I had to grip the edge of the workbench to steady myself. Grandpa hadn't just built me a lab. He'd built me a home for my mind. I walked the length of the space, running my hand along the smooth wood of the tables, the cool metal of the equipment. It smelled faintly of sawdust and something cleaner. New beginnings. By the time I circled back to the front, I knew I couldn't just let this place sit here as some monument to what could have been. It had to live. Over the next few weeks, I moved into the annex full-time. I called 2 old friends from my graduate program, Tara, a soil microbiologist with a laugh that could carry through a cornfield, and Micah, an agricultural engineer who could fix anything with duct tape and a stubborn streak. They didn't hesitate when I told them about the space. We started small, a local grant for micro-irrigation research, then a partnership with a regional farming co-op to test sustainable crop rotations. We made mistakes, burned out equipment, wrecked data sets, lost entire test beds to unexpected frosts, but every morning, we unlocked the doors and tried again. There was something about the annex that made failure feel less like defeat and more like a step in the right direction. Maybe it was the way the morning light poured in, or the fact that there was no one here to tell us we were wasting our time. One afternoon, after a brutal funding rejection, I found myself alone in the annex. The others had gone home. I sat on the floor beside the storage closet, surrounded by stacks of grant proposals and empty coffee cups. My bag was beside me, heavy with papers I didn't want to read. I reached in and pulled out Grandpa's letter, the one Mr. Kent had read that day in the living room. I unfolded it and found the line I'd already memorized. "You wrote your own role." It wasn't just encouragement, it was instruction. That night, I wrote a new proposal. Not for another irrigation system or seed trial, but for something entirely different. A youth science program in rural schools. For kids like I used to be. Quiet, curious, overlooked. We called it the Little Scientist Initiative. In our first year, we worked with just 12 students. They came from towns where the schools still used textbooks older than they were. No one had ever wheeled a microscope into their classrooms. Each child got a leather-bound notebook, a replica of mine, with Grandpa's words stamped on the inside cover. Write the things they don't understand. One day the world will. That fall, a shy girl named Amber, with hair that fell in her face like a curtain, handed me a notebook filled with pages of bee behavior observations she'd made on her own. The math was rough, the grammar wild, but her ideas were brilliant. When I told her that, she looked at me like I'd handed her a new planet. "You actually read it?" she whispered. "Of course I did," I said. And in that moment, I understood. This place wasn't about replacing what I'd lost. It was about planting something new in better soil and letting it grow without fear. It was 3 years after the will reading when I saw Melanie again. I was in the annex, standing over a tray of drought-resistant seedlings, checking their leaf moisture levels before the midday sun hit full strength. The hum of the ventilation system and the soft clink of glass were the only sounds, until the door opened. I looked up, expecting to see Tara or Micah returning from the community garden. Instead, my sister stood in the doorway. For a moment, I didn't recognize her. Gone were the sharp heels and perfectly set hair. She wore a navy coat a size too big for her shoulders, dark jeans, and sneakers that had seen better days. No makeup, no smug tilt to her chin. Her eyes landed on the framed portrait of Grandpa hanging above the reception desk. She didn't look at me yet. "He always knew who you were," she said quietly. "Even when I didn't. Especially when I didn't." The words didn't sound rehearsed. They didn't have the edge I'd grown up bracing for. "What do you want, Melanie?" I asked. My voice came out more even than I felt. She finally looked at me. "To see it. The lab. The work. What you've done with it." I could have said no. Part of me wanted to. But something in her tone, not contrition, exactly, but a kind of weary honesty, made me step aside. She walked slowly, as if the space might disappear if she moved too fast. We went through the greenhouse wing first, where trays of test crops lined the benches. She brushed her fingers lightly over the tops of tomato plants, their leaves cool and velvety. In the crop development room, she stopped to watch Micah's irrigation system cycle water through a network of narrow tubing. "How do you fund all this?" she asked. "Grants, partnerships, some private donors." She nodded, then pointed toward a piece of equipment. "What's that for?" "Seed viability testing." Her question stayed simple, practical. No small talk, no circling back to the past. When we reached the student display wall, covered with photos from the Little Scientist Initiative, she stopped again. The faces of kids grinning next to their projects stared back at us. Solar ovens made from cardboard, soil analyses from backyard gardens, a meticulously drawn chart of bird migration patterns. "They get to publish their results?" she asked. "If they want, we help them write it up." She didn't speak for a moment, just stared at a picture of Amber holding up her bee observation notebook. Finally, we stepped out into the community garden. A group of kids was harvesting lettuce. A mother and son laughed near the compost bins. A father used one of our field kits to test soil moisture. Melanie stopped walking. She gripped the railing that overlooked the beds, her hands moving restlessly, tugging her sleeves, tracing invisible circles on the metal. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said. Her voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. I wanted to see what he built for you, and what you built with it." I didn't answer right away. I didn't know what to say that wouldn't sound like a closing door or an open wound, so I let her stay as long as she wanted. No lectures, no rehearsed speeches, just the truth of what she was seeing. By the time she left, the sun had dipped low enough to cast long shadows across the garden. She paused at the doorway and glanced back once, her eyes on the portrait of Grandpa again. We didn't make plans to talk. I didn't ask for promises. But 2 months later, Melanie showed up for the first day of the summer session of the Little Scientist Initiative. She didn't come dressed like she was here to impress anyone. She came with a binder under her arm and introduced herself to the kids simply as Coach Mel. She taught them how to present their findings without reading from their notes, how to keep eye contact even when they were nervous, how to explain complicated ideas in plain language. The kids loved her. Some even started calling her Coach V, using the nickname she'd never liked when she was younger. At the end of the session, she handed me a folder. "I wrote a communication guide for the shy kids," she said, almost embarrassed. "Thought it might help." I opened it later that night. It wasn't perfect, but it was thoughtful, gentle, real. And for the first time in my life, I saw a version of my sister that didn't make me flinch. She never apologized with words, not directly. But she showed up. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. We're not sisters the way other people mean it. But, in this small corner of the world, Grandpa dreamed up. We've stopped pretending to be strangers. And somehow, that feels like the beginning of something true. 6 years passed before I saw my parents again. By then, the annex had outgrown its original footprint. What started as one converted barn was now a research campus. 4 laboratories, 3 greenhouses, and over 60 acres of trial fields. We developed drought-resistant seed varieties, feeding thousands in parts of the South where traditional crops failed. We'd partnered with universities from Kenya to Brazil, trading data and techniques that could keep communities fed through changing climates. Sometimes I thought Grandpa would be surprised at how far it had gone. But then, I remembered his quiet certainty, the way he'd watch me explain an idea and nod like he could already see where it would lead. Maybe this was exactly what he'd pictured. The Little Scientist Initiative had grown, too. We were working with more than 200 students across multiple counties. Every spring, the annex hosted a science fair where the projects took over every inch of open space: wind-powered irrigation systems, crop yield prediction models, experimental soil blends. The parents would come, some of them standing in the back, wide-eyed as they listened to their kids' present research like seasoned grad students. It was at one of those fairs that I saw them, my parents, standing near the back doors. They looked older, smaller somehow. My father's hair had gone mostly silver, his shoulders not quite as straight. My mother's smile was careful, unsure, the kind you give when you're entering a room you're not sure will welcome you. I finished listening to a group of kids explain their aquaponics project before walking over. "Faith," my father said, his voice formal, almost stiff. "Dad, Mom," I kept my tone neutral. "We heard about all this," my mother said, gesturing to the room full of students and projects. "It's impressive." I nodded once. The kids worked hard. For a moment, none of us spoke. Then my father cleared his throat. "I missed the ceremony," he said. And for a split second, I thought he meant the wedding. But then he added, "I saw the salute, though." My stomach tightened. That was years ago. "I know." He shifted his weight, looking at the floor before meeting my eyes again. "I never knew how to show up for a daughter in uniform. That's on me. I've got catching up to do, if you'll let me." The old me might have grasped at that, might have taken it as a victory, but now it felt different. Not a prize, not a finish line, just a choice. "We'll see," I said simply. They stayed for the rest of the fair, speaking politely to students, asking questions about the projects. They didn't push for more. Later, after everyone had gone and the annex was quiet again, I stood in the doorway of my office, watching the evening light spill across the fields. The magnolia trees were in bloom again. Somewhere beyond them, the old wooden bench Grandpa built still sat facing the stars. I thought about legacy, how people like to imagine it as something carved in stone or written into ledgers. But I'd learned it was more like a map, a set of small and deliberate marks left behind so the next person could find their way. I wasn't sure where things with my parents would go. Maybe they'd come back again, maybe they wouldn't. But either way, I had work to do, kids to mentor, seeds to plant. And I knew this much for certain: I'd stopped living for their acknowledgement a long time ago. Grandpa had been right. You write your own role. And if you do it well enough, one day the world will read it, and they won't be able to pretend they never saw you. The summer after my parents came to the science fair was one of the hottest on record. The air in Charleston carried a weight that clung to your skin, and even the magnolias seemed to droop under it. By late July, our trial fields were holding on, but barely. The drought-resistant varieties we'd spent years developing were showing signs of stress, leaves curling, flowers dropping early. We were still running irrigation, but our pumps were working overtime, and the power company had already warned of rolling blackouts. Tara came into my office one morning with a laptop tucked under her arm and sweat darkening the collar of her shirt. "We've got a problem," she said. Micah followed her in, holding a stack of printouts. "The pump on the east field failed sometime last night. We lost 2 rows completely." I stood, the chair wheels squeaking across the floor. "How bad?" "Bad enough that we'll need to replant if we want any data worth publishing this season," Tara said. "And we're already behind schedule." We went straight to the east field. The sun was merciless, beating down on the cracked soil. The plants that had been green and upright 2 days ago were wilted, some already brown at the edges. I knelt and pressed my fingers into the dirt. Dry. Too dry. "This isn't just a pump issue," I said. "Something's wrong upstream." By mid-afternoon, we confirmed it. A section of the main water line feeding the annex had ruptured. The county utility wouldn't be able to replace it for at least 3 weeks. 3 weeks without steady irrigation in this heat would undo months of work. Micah kicked at the ground, frustration flashing across his face. "We could truck in water from the river, but we'd need more tanks than we have." "And more hands," Tara added. "The interns can't haul that much in this heat." It was exactly the kind of moment Grandpa used to call a pivot point, the place where you either give up or get creative. That night, I sat in my office long after the others had gone, the hum of the ventilation system the only sound. On my desk was Grandpa's old pocket watch, the one Grandma gave me last year. I flipped it open and stared at the tiny photograph inside. Me, at 10 years old, standing next to my honeybee display at the county fair, grinning like I didn't know there were limits. I picked up my phone and scrolled to a number I hadn't used in years. My father's. When he answered, his voice was wary. "Faith?" "We've got a problem at the annex," I said. "The kind that needs more than duct tape." There was a pause. "What kind of problem?" "Water. The main line's down. County says 3 weeks minimum. We won't make it that long without a workaround." Another pause, then a shift in his tone. "I know someone in the Guard who can get you portable filtration and pump units. They're meant for field ops. But they'll do the job." I exhaled slowly. "How fast?" "If I make the call tonight, 2 days." It wasn't lost on me that I could have gone through other channels, but something about hearing him offer the solution, without condescension, without a lecture, made me want to let him. 2 days later, a flatbed truck pulled up to the annex with 3 portable pump units and enough hose to run a makeshift irrigation loop. My father climbed down from the passenger seat, wearing a faded ball cap and work gloves. "I'll show you how to set them up," he said. We worked side by side for hours in the heat, stringing hose, priming the pumps, adjusting the intake filters. He didn't try to fill the silence with small talk. I didn't either. But there was something in the way he moved, deliberate, practiced, that reminded me he'd spent most of his life solving problems under worse conditions. When the first pump roared to life and water surged through the line, the sound was like relief itself. Tara and Micah cheered from the far end of the field. We ran the system for a full hour before shutting it down to check for leaks. None. As the sun dipped low and the air finally cooled, my father stood with his hands on his hips, looking out over the newly watered rows. "You've built something here," he said quietly. "Bigger than I thought." I didn't answer. I wasn't ready to unpack whatever he meant by that. Before he left, he handed me a folded sheet of paper. "If anything else breaks, call this number." They owe me a favor. When his truck disappeared down the road, I slipped the paper into the same desk drawer where I kept Grandpa's letter. That night, for the first time in a long while, I realized the annex wasn't just bridging gaps between research and results. It was, in its own way, bridging something inside my family too, not fixed, not forgiven, but maybe no longer entirely broken. The portable pumps worked better than I'd dared hope. Within a week, the east field was holding steady, and the crops that had looked half dead were standing tall again. It wasn't a perfect fix. The system was loud, temperamental, and needed constant fuel, but it bought us time. Time in a summer like this was worth more than any grant. Every evening after the last intern left, I'd walk the perimeter of the fields, checking for leaks, listening to the hum of the pumps under the chorus of cicadas. One night, I found my father there before me. He was leaning on the fence, watching the irrigation arcs sweep over the rows like slow, deliberate handwriting. "Old rigs like these," he said, nodding toward the pumps, "will teach you patience or break you trying." "Sounds familiar," I replied, and for the first time in years, he smiled at something I'd said. We talked for a while, about pump maintenance, about fuel storage. Nothing that would make a stranger think there was anything deeper going on. But I could feel it. The edges between us weren't quite as sharp as they used to be. A week later, he came back with a box of replacement filters and a cooler of iced tea. My mother was in the passenger seat this time. She stayed in the truck at first, sunglasses on, flipping through a magazine. But eventually, she got out and walked toward the garden beds, where some of the little scientist kids were finishing their afternoon project. I watched from a distance as one of the girls, maybe 10 years old, showed her a diagram of the irrigation system they'd built from recycled soda bottles. My mother bent down to see the drawing better. She nodded. She asked a question. And when the girl answered, she smiled. Not the brittle, social smile I remembered, but something small and almost real. Later, as they were leaving, my mother walked up to me. "They're bright kids," she said. "They are?" I answered. In the weeks that followed, the heat finally broke. The county utility repaired the main water line, and we retired the pumps. But my father didn't take them back. "Consider them on loan until you don't need them anymore," he said. We settled into a new kind of rhythm. Every couple of weeks, my father would stop by to check the pump units or bring supplies. Sometimes my mother came with him. She never stayed long, but she always walked through the student workroom before leaving, looking at the latest projects pinned to the walls. One afternoon in early fall, after the kids had gone home, I found her there alone, standing in front of a photo from the previous year's science fair. It was Amber, holding up her bee observation notebook. "She looks like you," my mother said without turning. I stood beside her. "She's a lot braver than I was at her age." My mother glanced at me, her eyes shadowed. "You were braver than I gave you credit for." It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was closer than anything I'd heard from her before, that night. I sat on the porch with Grandma, telling her about it. She sipped her coffee, nodded slowly, and said, "Sometimes the change you get isn't the change you dreamed about. Doesn't mean it's not worth keeping." By winter, the annex was busier than ever. The new seed trials were thriving, and we'd secured a multi-year grant to expand our school programs into 2 neighboring counties. Melanie had taken on a more formal role, coordinating the communication workshops for the students. She was good at it, patient in ways I'd never seen, firm without making the shy kids retreat. One evening, after the last meeting of the season, I locked up the annex and found her waiting outside. "I heard Dad's been helping out," she said. "He has," she hesitated. "I don't know how you're doing it, letting them in, even a little." "I'm not," I said. "Not all the way, but they're here when it matters. That's more than I expected." She nodded, like she understood something she hadn't before. If you can hold that line, maybe I can too." It struck me then that this, not the crops, not the grants, not even the expansion, was the real test. Not letting people take more than you could give, but also not closing the door so tightly that nothing could get through. The next spring, the magnolia trees bloomed early. I was walking the community garden paths with a new group of students when I noticed my father standing by the old bench at the far edge of the property. He wasn't wearing his usual ball cap. He wasn't in uniform, either. Just a plain shirt, hands in his pockets, looking out toward the fields. When he saw me, he raised a hand, not quite a wave, not quite a salute. I raised mine back, and for the first time, it didn't feel like I was reaching for something that would never come. It felt like I was returning a gesture that was already there. The spring brought more than magnolia blossoms. It brought an invitation I never expected. The Department of Agriculture was hosting a national symposium on sustainable crop innovation, and one of the keynote speakers had dropped out last minute. They wanted me to take the slot, 40 minutes on stage, national press coverage, an audience full of researchers, policymakers, and funders. I should have been thrilled, but as soon as I hung up the phone, my stomach knotted. It wasn't the public speaking. I'd presented enough times to know my pacing, my tone, my slides. It was knowing who might be in that room. My father still had ties in military logistics and occasionally consulted for government agencies. My mother's network in social charities wasn't far removed from some of the symposium's sponsors. If they came, it would be the first time they'd see me in my element, entirely on my own terms. 2 weeks later, I stood backstage at the conference center in Washington, D.C., my name projected in clean white letters above a photograph of the annex at sunrise. The moderator leaned toward me. "You've got a full house," he whispered. I stepped into the lights. The room was wide, the kind that swallows voices if you don't aim them right. Rows upon rows of faces looked up from their notepads, tablets, and coffee cups. And there, in the fifth row center, sat my father, my mother next to him. Melanie 2 seats down. I didn't let myself linger on them. I started the way I'd planned, with the story of the first greenhouse Grandpa had let me build in the back field. The audience laughed in the right places when I described its collapse, and they stilled when I spoke about what he called a perfect disaster, not a failure, but a prototype. From there, I walked them through the annex evolution, the seed trials that survived heat waves, the school programs that turned quiet kids into confident presenters, the partnerships that spanned continents. I didn't shy away from the setbacks, the pump failures, the lost crops, because those were the moments that taught us as much as the successes did. As I closed, I said, "We like to think legacy is a monument, but it's really a map, one that marks the paths taken, the detours worth remembering, and the roads you hope someone else will travel farther than you could." The applause rose like a tide. I stepped back from the podium, heart pounding, scanning the room without meaning to. My father was standing, my mother too. Melanie was clapping, her eyes on me in a way I'd never seen before, not assessing, not competing, just seeing. Afterward, in the mingling chaos of handshakes and business cards, I felt a tap on my shoulder. My father. "You did good?" he said simply. Not the clipped military "good job" of my childhood, but something quieter, warmer. "Thank you," I replied. My mother stepped forward. "You've built something important. Faith. I hope you know that." "I do," I said, and for the first time, it didn't feel like I was saying it to convince myself. Back in Charleston a week later, the annex felt both exactly the same and completely different. The same morning light through the east wall, the same low murmur of students setting up their projects, but the edges of something that had once been sharp between me and my family felt worn down, not gone, but smoother. One Saturday, my father showed up unannounced with a packet of heirloom seed corn he'd gotten from a retired colleague. "Thought you might want to run a trial," he said. "We planted it in the farthest field, the one Grandpa used to walk with me, pointing out where the soil stayed moist longest after a rain. As we worked, I realized this was the first time we'd planted something together without an unspoken agenda hanging over it. Just hands in the dirt, side by side. When we finished, we stood at the edge of the field. The furrows stretched in neat lines toward the horizon, the seeds tucked under warm soil. "You know," he said, "I never built anything that lasted this long without being torn down and rebuilt." I glanced at him. "Maybe you just needed the right blueprint." He chuckled, low and almost to himself. "Maybe I did." That night, I walked back to that field alone. The moonlight silvered the rows, and the air smelled of earth and the faint sweetness of magnolia. I thought of all the seasons ahead, the ones we'd be ready for and the ones we wouldn't, and I understood that whatever came next, the lines we'd planted here, in soil, in family, were finally holding. By late summer, the heirloom corn stood shoulder high, its green leaves sharp and clean against the blue sky. Walking between the rows was like moving through a narrow cathedral, the air heavy with the scent of sun-warmed stalks. It had been months since the symposium in D.C., and in that time my parents had become semi-regular fixtures at the annex, never intrusive, never overstepping, but present. My father would stop by to check the pumps or drop off a tool he thought we might need. My mother would sometimes bring lemonade for the kids in the community garden, staying long enough to ask about their projects. One morning in August, Grandma joined me for our weekly walk out to the far field. She moved slower these days, leaning a little on my arm, but her eyes were as sharp as ever. "Looks like you're going to have a good harvest," she said, touching the edge of a leaf. "I think so," I replied. "Micah says we should get enough yield to run a full test batch." She smiled, the lines at the corners of her mouth deepening. "Your grandfather would have liked that, planting something old to see if it could live in new conditions." As we reached the end of the row, I saw two figures coming toward us from the road, my father and mother. He carried a canvas bag slung over one shoulder, and she held a camera. "We thought you might want some photos," my mother said when they reached us. "For the archive." It was such a small thing, but the fact that she called it the archive, acknowledging that this work was worth documenting, landed heavier than I expected. We spent the morning walking the rows together. My father checked the irrigation lines, pointing out where a fitting might need tightening. My mother snapped photos of the tassels catching the light. Melanie showed up halfway through, with a few of the older students from the program, and soon we had a little procession moving between the stalks, voices overlapping in a way that felt easy. When the harvest came in September, we set up long tables under the magnolia trees for sorting and weighing. The corn was a success, high germination rates, clean kernels, and a flavor so rich it made even the younger kids pause mid-bite. We cooked some that afternoon in big pots over portable burners, serving it with butter and salt to anyone who wanted a taste. As the sun dipped lower, I found myself sitting on the old wooden bench at the edge of the property, the same one Grandpa had built, facing the fields. My father sat down beside me without asking. "You've done something here I never managed in my own career," he said. "What's that?" He looked out over the rows, now golden in the fading light. "You made something that lasts, not because it's locked down tight, but because you let other people carry it with you." I thought about that for a long moment. I guess I stopped worrying about who'd take credit and started caring about whether it would keep going. He nodded, and for once, there was no sense of competition in his eyes, just agreement. Before he left, he handed me a small square package wrapped in brown paper. "From your grandfather's desk," he said. "I think he meant for you to have it when the time was right." Inside was a brass compass, its surface worn smooth, the needle still swinging true. Etched on the underside of the lid were 5 words: "Find your own true north." That night, after everyone had gone, I stood alone in the annex, holding the compass in my palm. The lights from the greenhouses glowed through the east wall, and somewhere in the dark beyond, the magnolias whispered in the wind. The road ahead wasn't going to be perfect. Crops would fail. Grants would get rejected. People would disappoint me. But the lines we'd planted here, in the soil, in the work, and in what passed for family now, felt strong enough to hold. And for the first time in my life, I knew exactly which direction I was heading. Conclusion. True north. The compass stayed on my desk after that. Not as a decoration, but as a reminder. Every time I felt the tug to explain myself, to prove my worth to someone who'd already decided not to see it, I'd run my thumb over the engraved words. Find your own true north. It wasn't just advice. It was a quiet order from someone who'd known all along that my direction couldn't be charted on anyone else's map. The annex kept growing. The fields kept changing with the seasons. Seedlings, full bloom, harvest, rest. The Little Scientist Initiative doubled again, reaching into rural corners of the state where science programs were nothing more than dusty textbooks and outdated posters. The students who'd once walked in here hiding behind notebooks now stood in front of local boards, explaining soil pH like they'd been born doing it. And my family. Well, family began to mean something different. It wasn't about bloodlines or shared names. It was about who showed up when the pumps failed, who walked the rows with you in August heat, who believed in the work even when the grant committee didn't. My father never became the man who said, "I'm proud of you," easily. My mother never turned into someone who called just to talk, but they came to the Harvest Festival every year. They shook hands with the students. They listened. They contributed in small, steady ways. Melanie became a constant presence, not because we forced forgiveness, but because we learned to stand beside each other without trying to rewrite the past. Some wounds stayed, but they no longer dictated every step forward. One evening in late fall, I walked out to the far bench alone. The fields were quiet, the magnolias bare, the air crisp enough to carry the smell of earth and wood smoke. I sat with the compass in my hand and thought about how far we'd come, not just the annex, but me. I remembered the day at the will reading when my parents told me to go earn your own. At the time, it felt like a dismissal, a severing. Now, I could see the irony. They'd given me the space, even if unintentionally, to build something that didn't need their permission or their stamp of approval. The truth was, I had earned my own. Not just the property, not just the work, but a life that felt entirely mine. And I had done it with the help of people who saw me clearly, even when they had no obligation to. Sometimes revenge is loud, a dramatic gesture, a public victory. Mine wasn't. Mine was quiet, steady, season after season, until there was no way to deny what stood in the field. Legacy, I'd learned, wasn't a monument. It was a living thing, a map drawn in furrows and footpaths, in notebooks filled with observations, in seeds planted by hands that didn't care who got the credit. As the last light faded, I stood and looked back toward the annex. The windows glowed against the dark, warm and steady, like a lighthouse on a coastline I'd built myself. I slipped the compass into my pocket. Whatever storms came next, in the weather, in the work, in the fragile, still changing landscape of my family, I knew the lines I'd planted would hold, because I wasn't following anyone else's bearing anymore. I had my own true north,